Welcome, everybody. Well, everybody here and also everybody who's watching this on the DVD. I'd like to begin by saying a few things about the context of our meeting here tonight and about the purpose of these lectures and about what we're up to. So these lectures are actually being put on by the Esalen Center for Theory and Research. The Esalen Center for Theory and Research is an organization founded by Michael Murphy, who many of you may have heard of. He's the person who founded Esalen, which has been so important, an institution in our community. And one of the things that Mike Murphy likes to do is he's a scholar, and he convenes groups of scholars, people who are really deeply into their work and very competent, and he brings people together to discuss issues and themes that are not being discussed anywhere in academia. So he's sort of filling the need for discussing things that just don't fit into the academic context. And one of the conferences that we have going at Esalen, and it's been going on for quite a few years now, is a conference on reincarnation and on life after death. There's a group of scientists, particularly there's a group of them at the University of Virginia, I believe, who've been studying this issue for a long time. And in fact, there's a tradition of studying this issue of reincarnation and life after death scientifically, which goes back to William James and Frederick Myers and other people about 100 years ago or more. And there is an enormous amount of evidence, real, hard scientific evidence, which makes it very clear that in fact we do not die with the death of our bodies, and makes it extremely plausible that we reincarnate. Now, the issue of what happens to us after our body dies is an extraordinarily important issue. I mean, in some way, it's like the most important issue we could talk about. What happens to the personality? What happens to us? And what happens to the people we love when they die and they cease to function in our waking life? Where do they go? Where do we go? What happens? And the issue is immensely important to the whole structure of our civilization, because the fact that we believe that at the end of our physical existence our personality ceases strongly affects our outlook on life. It affects our sense of ethics, right? And it profoundly affects our values, so that if we believe that at the end of our physical life our personality dies, what's life for? What's it about? Right? It becomes nothing but an opportunity to gratify our emotional, intellectual, and physical needs for a short while before we're reduced to extinction. And that kind of attitude toward life and that kind of attitude towards ethics very much encourages the tide of consumerism under which we find ourselves buried. If, on the other hand, we do survive the death of our bodies, and if, on the other hand, we are involved in a sequence of reincarnations, which is somehow a part of the evolution of the universe, somehow part of the cosmogenesis of which we are a part, then our whole attitude towards ourselves and our whole attitude toward life has to change. The whole question of our destiny, the whole question of the meaning of our existence, and all of our attitudes towards ethics will change. And also, just think about this. Suppose we were to really come to believe that people's personalities do survive bodily death, and suppose that we were to find a way to regularly communicate with people who had died. What would that do to our property laws? This is really interesting, right? Who owns the property at that point, right? And who has the disposition over the affairs? So you can see this is a really profound issue. And remarkably enough, it is not being considered in any institution that we know of in the United States or in the world. As far as we've been able to figure out, the group of us who are doing work on this at Esalen are the only group of serious academics who are working to understand and to fathom the human destiny, the facts of our life, the profound nature of the human life cycle. So the seminar began about 7 or 8 years ago with people who were mainly scientists and were really trying to get a handle on the evidence. What is the evidence for life after death? And what is the evidence for reincarnation? And that went on for about 7 years. And in fact, the people in the conference at that time wrote a book called Irreducible Mind, which at least is an attempt to demonstrate conclusively, in fact it does demonstrate, I think conclusively, that there is something to the personality that's more than the body and that might survive. The book does at least that. But in general, all of us who've been involved in examining this data have come to the conclusion that it's simply a fact. It's a fact that we do incarnate more than once. And it's a fact that the personality that we form during our life does in fact survive the death of the body. And so we've stopped examining the evidence so much, and we've all changed our focus. And now our work is trying to say, okay, if this is true, how do we understand it? And so I've been working with the group for several years now as part of this effort to come up with a theory or a theoretical framework within which we can make sense of reincarnation and make sense of life after death. And also there are some other phenomena that come with it that we also need to understand. Now, if it is the case that we survive the death of our bodies, that has certain implications. In order for that to be true, it must be the case that our personalities, whatever we mean by that, but our personalities must somehow transcend our physical bodies. It must be possible for us to have intentions which modify what happens in our bodies, as they do, but also it must be possible for us to continue existing even when the physical body has died. That means, if that's the case, what manner of being are we? What kind of being can do that? So before I answer that question, let me look at some of the evidence that we have come to take as conclusive in suggesting that, in fact, the human life cycle does not end with the death of the physical body. So for one thing, there's the testament of every culture in history prior to the last 300 years. Every culture prior to ours assumed and knew that human beings lived after physical death. And most cultures had a very prominent place for dealing with the ancestors. People would have shrines to their ancestors. People would communicate with their ancestors. And we can't assume that these people were just somehow unenlightened or primitive. These were people who were genetically identical to us, and at least as smart as we were. And throughout history, they had the experience that communing with ancestors was an effective activity. Now, another really interesting piece of evidence, and one that is perhaps the most scientifically conclusive, is the research that was done by Stevenson. I forget Stevenson's first name. Do I remember? Anyway, this guy Stevenson did research on what they call cases of the reincarnation type, or court. What they found was that there are a lot of children, very young children, who have vivid and detailed memories of previous lives. They'll start saying when they're 3 or 4 years old, oh, I don't really belong here. I belong in this other house. And my sister is named this, and my brother is named this, and my cat is named this. But in that lifetime, I was killed, I died in this way. And they have the whole story. And so Stevenson went out and began to interview these children. He found out that almost all of them claimed to have lived and died in the recent past and in geographical proximity. They weren't very far away. And so he went out and he started investigating these cases. And people said, well, I came from this town 20 miles away. He'd go there, and sure enough, he'd find the family to which they had belonged.